Okay, welcome to our first class in Ethics of the Fathers. We've been going through Ethics of the Fathers for years. I don't remember how many years, but for some reason, for most of the people here, we're starting all over again. There's a Jewish custom to study Ethics of the Fathers after Passover. But that doesn't mean you can't study it any other time of the year. It's always an appropriate area of study for reasons that will become apparent. The name of this part of the Mishnah is divided into 60 tractates. And this tractate is in the fourth division, entitled Nezikin, damages. The whole of that order of the Mishnah deals with laws of civil and criminal law. And somewhere in the middle, it has a focus on ethics. And it's called, the Hebrew name for it is one word, avos, or avot. Just one word. Somehow, in English, they began to refer to it as Ethics of the Fathers, because it does deal with ethics, but that's not the official name. The official name is just Avos, Fathers. Why is it called Fathers? No one knows for sure what the reason is. Nowhere does it say in the Mishnah itself why it's called Fathers, but there are different theories about it. One theory is that the study of ethics, which generates sense of awe and reverence for God, because when you're dealing with law as opposed to ethics, you're dealing with just things that are absolute requirements. A society cannot exist without laws. But ethics is a different story. In America, as well as in any other civilized country, we distinguish between what's legal and what's ethical. Sometimes what's unethical may not be illegal, and you won't get cited for it, you won't get prosecuted for it, because it's not illegal, it's just unethical. Now in Judaism, we also have the division between legal and ethical. Be imprisoned, you have to realize, you have to realize that discuss all sorts of topics. If you want to understand their opinions throughout the Talmud, you get it from this tractate. You get it from their ethical teachings. You can see what kind of a mindset they had. You can see how they thought, their thought processes. When you talk about legal arguments, you can't always know the person's thought process, but when you deal with the ethics, it tells you more about their spiritual makeup and what is the basis for all their other teachings. That's why it's called Fathers, because the teachings here are the sources for all their other teachings throughout the Talmud. There's an interesting parallel between Ethics of the Fathers and the whole entirety of the Mishnah. The Mishnah is the collection of all Jewish laws that were passed down orally until they were put into writing. The Mishnah begins with the letter Mem, the Hebrew letter Mem, and ends with the Hebrew letter Mem. The last word of the Mishnah is Olam. So it begins with a Mem and ends with a Mem. The same thing, Ethics of the Fathers begins with a Mem, the word Moshe, and it ends with a Mem. So you see that there's a certain parallel between Ethics of the Fathers. It's like a micro of the entire Mishnah. It's the father of the entire Mishnah.
What does Mishnah mean? Does Mishnah have a meaning, or is it just a name?
No, Mishnah comes from the root, which means to teach, to learn, to teach. Talmud also means that.
Right? Mishnah is change.
Mishnah is to change. That's a different word. The same root could mean teach. It can mean repetition, changing, repeating. And that's because when you learn, you have to keep on learning and repeating, and not just saying, I learned it one time and I know it. You have to keep on reviewing. That's the nature of learning. The Talmud says the following: if you want to be a chassid, you study avos, ethics of the fathers. What is the definition of a chassid? The definition of a chassid, which is a biblical term, means someone who is extremely conscientious, is not just satisfied with doing the minimal, but wants to do the maximum. That's the definition of a chassid. It comes from the Hebrew word chesed, kindness. Someone who is utterly kind, not just doing what they have to do, but they go beyond in their relationship with God and their relationship with their fellow human being. So the Talmud says, if you want to be a chassid, you study avos. You study this tractate. Then the Talmud says, if you want to be a chassid, you study the laws of damages. If you want to be a chassid, the Talmud says, you should also study the laws of, before we partake of food, we recite a blessing as a way of showing our reverence for God. So the Rabbi says, when you study ethics of the fathers, you get the other two as well. That prevents you from causing damages to others. It prevents you from being a threat to others. And at the same time, it elicits all the blessings. You get all these different blessings. That's why this particular part of the Mishnah is so highly regarded, and in learning the laws of the Mishnah, feel very comfortable learning ethics of the fathers, and it resonates with them. So let's begin with the opening, receive the Torah from Sinai. It doesn't say at Sinai, it says from Sinai, and I'm going to explain later what that means. But let's leave it at, he received the Torah and transmitted it to Joshua. Moses transmitted it to all the Jews, not just to Joshua, but Joshua was the primary transmitter or recipient of the Torah and then transmitting it further. Joshua was Moses' trusted disciple and successor. Moses is referred to sometimes as the sun and Joshua as the moon. What's the relationship of the sun, the moon to the sun? The moon doesn't have any light of its own. It just reflects the sunlight. That's how Joshua didn't have anything of his own. That means everything that he had was a reflection of what he got from Moses. He was the most trusted student. And Joshua passed it on to the elders. These are generations of great leaders to whom he passed it down. Of course, one passed it down to the next generation. The elders passed it down to the prophets. The era of prophecy obviously began with Adam. Adam was a prophet. He communicated with God. Noah was a prophet. Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob and the matriarchs were all prophets. Moses was the greatest of prophets, but the era of prophecy begins usually when we describe it with the prophet Samuel, Shmuel, who lived a few hundred years after Moses. So in between Joshua, you had a few centuries of leaders, of elders, and then you had the era of prophets beginning with Shmuel, with Samuel, and that continued for a few hundred years.
How many elders were there?
It doesn't give us a number. We don't have a number. It means all the leaders of every generation. If you want to count, the book of Judges, you'll just read all the names of all the judges, and they were presumably what we mean by elders, the judges who were the leaders. Such Shimshon, for example, was one of them. Samson was one of them.
Did they say 70 Shivim?
That was initially in the desert. Moses transmitted the Torah to Joshua and to the 70 elders then. But this goes beyond. This is the later stage. And the prophets passed it on to the men of the Great Assembly. The men of the Great Assembly was a group of leaders, prophets, scholars. Among them you have Ezra, who was the leader of the Jewish people at the time of the Second Temple. You had Mordechai, the hero of Purim. He was one of the members. And you had a total of 120 And they lived at the time of the Second Temple's beginning, during that period, and they composed much of the prayers that we use today and that we have been using for 2,000 years. They were the composers of those prayers. So they were like the last stage before we start reading about their teachings. And they said three things: be patient in justice, in rendering justice, raise many disciples, and make a fence around the Torah. So let's go back to the beginning of this to try to understand what it means when it says that Moses received the Torah at Sinai. It should have just said Moses received the Torah from God. Why does it mention at Sinai? What's the point of mentioning that it was at Sinai? So there are many different explanations. I'll give a few of them. The Maharal says that when you indicate a certain location, then you mean that it's something that was like scheduled, something that was fixed, a certain place. It wasn't just casual. When God speaks to Bilam, the heathen prophet who was evil, the Torah uses the word vayikar. He just happened to bump into him. He would not make a special time and place to meet with him. If you have to give a message to someone who's a real lowlife and someone you really despise and someone you really don't want to have any relationship with, you're not going to schedule a certain place and time for that communication. So by saying at Sinai, this means that this was a special period and special place for the giving of the Torah. That the giving of the Torah was not a haphazard thing, was not a be repeated again. Even in the Messianic age, we will not have another revelation at Sinai, because what God gave us at Sinai will serve us, has served us for all of history, and will serve us for all of the future history. So that's the idea, to make this, the giving of the Torah giving it a fixture, a structure, that it happened in a very important place at Sinai. That's one explanation. The Rebbe gives four different explanations. The Rebbe says the simple understanding is, what do we read in the Torah when we read about Sinai? When the Torah was given, it wasn't just a casual thing. It was given with awe. The people were in utter awe, trepidation. They were just so inspired. It was the most inspirational event of all of history. But nevertheless, the goal is that we should experience Torah in a powerful way, resembling the experience we had at Sinai. So it's not just telling us where the Torah was given, it's telling us what mindset do we have to have when we study Torah. When we study Torah, it's the most powerful spiritual event, even though today we're just learning from a limited number of teachers with a limited amount of knowledge and so on. It's the same Torah that was given at Sinai. Nothing changed. Another thing, when the Torah was given at Mount Sinai, it wasn't the first time God communicated to us, to the Jewish people, and gave them commandments. Before they got to Sinai, they were given other commandments. The Shabbos, for example, was given to the Jewish people in a place called Marah. But yet, everything that God said before Sinai was reiterated at Sinai. Because what happened before Sinai is not why we do those things. Maimonides puts it the following: we don't circumcise our children because Abraham did so. We do it because God told Moses at Mount Sinai that we're supposed to be circumcised. Yes, we describe it as the circumcision of Abraham because he was the first person to be given the commandment, but we don't do it because Abraham told us we have to do it. We do it because of Sinai, because what happened at Sinai was a revolution. Before Sinai, the spiritual and the physical realms were designed to be separate. They were dichotomous by design. In other words, you couldn't make the physical world holy. At Sinai, that changed. The decree that separated between the upper and the lower, the heavenly and the earthly, was removed. and we are able to make the physical world something of a different nature. We transform it into something spiritual and godly. So every mitzvah that we do, whether it was given before Sinai or after, is really connected to Sinai, because every mitzvah we do is what creates that revolution, that creates that synthesis of the spiritual and the physical. One other, yes?
When Noah gave a sacrifice, when...
Yes, they did. Noah did mitzvahs. He was told to bring kosher animals separately from the non-kosher. Every non-kosher 2 of each, the kosher 7 of each.
He offered the ark and gave a sacrifice.
Yes,
After commanded to, right?
he was not commanded to, no. But he understood that that's what God wanted from him, because God told him to bring 7 of the kosher animals. Why would that be necessary, to have more kosher than non-kosher? Because he understood that God wanted him to bring sacrifices, so that he had to have more of this.
If that was holy because that was before...
It couldn't change. Actually, the Rabbi in one of his talks says that the only exception to the rule that the spiritual and the physical couldn't meet, there were 2 exceptions. One exception was circumcision, that Abraham performed, and the second one was sacrifices. That's where the physical actually became something spiritual, but that was the exception to the rule. Yes?
I've heard that we were all there at Sinai, all our souls.
Yes,
right?
that's right. That's right.
Kala Yisrael.
Yes, the entirety of the Jewish people, every soul of every Jew who was born Jewish, who converted to Judaism according to Jewish law, their souls were at Mount Sinai.
Until today, until the future, every generation.
Right. So, another explanation the Rebbe gives is that the Torah was given at Mount Sinai has a paradoxical message. Why was Sinai chosen? Because it was the lowest mountain in that region. And God wants to emphasize the importance of humility. So the question is asked, then why on a mountain? He should have given it in a valley. If you want to emphasize humility, you give it at the lowest place, not on a mountain, though it's low, but it's still a mountain. So the Rebbe explains, and others as well, that a Jew has to have the paradoxical approach to Judaism. On one hand, you have to be proud that you're Jewish, that you have Judaism. You have to be strong and firm and not bend and not just do whatever the society wants you to do. You have to stand strong and firm and be proud of who you are. And at the same time, you have to be humble. So the mountain message is that you have to be strong and upbeat and optimistic and firm. At the same time, you have to be humble, as Moses himself was. And one of the traits of Mashiach, it says that he's, on one hand, he's on a cloud, and the other hand, he's on a donkey, and a poor man riding on a donkey. He has both of these characteristics. So that's why it says Moses received the Torah from Sinai, that we have to learn this twin lesson from Sinai. But then, the question is, it should have said Moses received the Torah from Sinai. It could have said he received the Torah from Mount Sinai, or from God at Mount Sinai. So there is an explanation given by, I found 2 sources for this explanation. One is a Sephardic source, the Chidah, Reb Chaim Yosef David Azalor, who lived about 250 years ago, and the other is from the Chassam Sofer, who lived about 175 years ago. And they say something very cute. Moses was humble, we know. So humble that when God said, I want you to be the redeemer of the Jewish people, I want you to be their leader, he said, no, who am I? I'm not qualified. I can't do it. God's telling you to do it, and you're saying no. I mean, it takes a certain amount of either chutzpah, or he was genuinely so humble that he really thought of himself as being the least qualified person to be the Redeemer. And he argued with God for a week, until finally he accepted it. He had no choice. And yet, when God tells him to be the one to bring the Torah, he doesn't say no. He doesn't argue with God. Why didn't he argue? He should have said, God, why are you giving it through me? I'm a nobody.
Because he gave up.
He gave up.
He said,
Okay, that's a good explanation. He gave up already on arguing with God. He knew God was going to prevail. But there's another answer. He saw that God chose to give the Torah at Sinai. Sinai was the lowest of mountains. So he figured, you know what? Associate Torah with hatred. Associate Torah with hatred. So the Talmud says that where did hatred of the Jewish people come from? Sinai. Detractors to hate us. Some of them love us. We have non-Jews who love the Jewish people precisely because they realize that the Jewish people are the chosen people, and some people hate us because of that.
I don't understand what it means to be the chosen people.
What the chosen people means?
I said the people who hate us because we're means to be chosen.
Oh, okay.
We got a mission and it's big.
Right, they don't understand it, and sometimes it's not rational. It doesn't have to be based on understanding or not understanding. Yes.
So on Sinai, Moses had these rules, ethic rules and general rules. What rules had Jewish people after Abraham, between Abraham and Moses?
What rules do they have? Well, circumcision. Jews had to be circumcised. Abraham's children, descendants. What?
The Noahide laws.
The Noahide laws they had even before Abraham, but in addition to the Noahide laws,
Between Abraham and Moses.
okay, the only laws they had were circumcision, and then in Egypt before the Exodus they had to bring the Karban Pesach, the Paschal offering. According to the Maimonides, the idea of tithing, you're giving of 10% of your produce to charity, to the Kohen, to poor people, that was already in existence. That came through Isaac. So then before Sinai, they got the Shabbos, the laws of Shabbos they got before Sinai. The laws of honoring parents they got before Sinai.
What about Nida?
No,
That was Torah?
that was in the Torah. Yeah, it could be. Kosher, no. They didn't have to keep kosher. Now, the Talmud does say that Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob knew the Torah beforehand. It was revealed to them. And they kept as much as they were able to keep. So they did keep kosher. Abraham kept kosher, and he kept all the laws of the Torah that he was able to keep. So Isaac and so Jacob.
But if Noah had kosher animals to sacrifice, the laws of kashrut weren't applicable then? Weren't given?
No, they weren't applicable, but he knew of them.
Okay.
Now, what are these different generations? Why is it emphasizing that Moses received the Torah at Sinai? So the commentaries explain that the Jewish belief, of course, is that the Torah was given to us by God at Mount Sinai. All the laws of the Torah, all 613 commandments. But ethics, people would say, that's man-made. Just like every culture has its own ethics. People will tell you that Jewish ethics is also man-made. That's why the Mishnah emphasizes here that no, just like Moses received the laws of the Torah, the commandments of the Torah, Moses also received the ethical teachings and passed them down. And therefore, they don't change. See, one of the 13 principles of faith, Maimonides enumerates, is that the Torah that was given to us by God will never change, cannot change, because they are all divine. So some people would say that ethics is different. Ethics is relative, it's situational. It's relative to the period in which we live. Look at society. In the last 100 years, changes in what people consider to be ethical and what people consider to be non-ethical. I'll give you this goes into the area of law as well, not just ethics, but I'll just use this as an illustration. Well, I once taught a class at UB. I taught a class in Jewish medical ethics. I think you took it.
One of two.
And no, this was a larger class. It was
I was the one there was one other student.
I taught it for many years, so tell me if you were at this class.
Okay.
And there was this woman who was involved with Planned Parenthood, I think, or some similar organization, and she was arguing for abortion, pro-abortion. And she said, I personally would not want an abortion, but I think it should be perfectly legal. There's nothing wrong with it. So I asked her the question like this: do you consider the choice of abortion versus no abortion to be the same choice as dyeing your hair red or green? You may not want to dye your hair green. That's a personal choice. It has nothing to do with ethics and morality. Do you consider the choice of abortion to be in that category? And she says, yes. And there was a student in that class who said, I was pro-abortion until I heard that answer. So unless it was you, so this was not the class that you attended. It was another year.
One of the problems with this particular subject is that nowadays, if in the medical text, language, if a woman has an abortion, she may have miscarried. A miscarriage is labeled abortion. And so there are many times that a woman will miscarry. In fact, 1 out of 5 pregnancies ends in a miscarriage.
Well, I'm not talking about that.
I know, but nowadays that is labeled as an abortion, and if there are complications, the woman is not allowed medical treatment.
Okay, I'm not going into, Jewish law allows abortion in some cases, so I'm not going into but an abortion, even when it's allowed, and even though if it's mandated, is a tragedy. A diabetic is told that they have to amputate a leg. No one celebrates amputation of a leg and say, well, it's great, it's saving my life, and let's celebrate. You're happy that you're alive, of course, but it's a sad thing to take. Again, I'm not saying whether abortion is allowed or not allowed. There are cases where Jewish law allows it and requires it, in certain cases where it says no, absolutely forbidden. But whatever the situation is, the value system in Judaism and Jewish ethics is that it's a tragedy, because there's a life there, however we describe that life. So I'm not going into the different situations where abortion might be necessary. And I'm not talking about whether the government should be involved and not be involved. That's a subject that we don't have time to get into. But I'm just using that as an illustration. If you go back 50 years, everyone would have agreed with what I just said, that it's not a matter of choice between dyeing your hair red or dyeing your hair green. It's a very, very serious matter, and it's a very serious ethical matter, and it's a negative, it's not a positive. No matter what the situation is, it's a negative situation. But that's just an example of how people's mindset changes. Based on what? What changes causes a person's mindset to change? Well, my theory is, with abortion, just to use, I might not be right about this, but I'm just giving this as an illustration, that because people became more promiscuous and less responsible, and therefore they became pregnant when they didn't want to, so it required getting rid of that pregnancy, and you have to then rationalize it, that it's acceptable. But if anyone says, I'm pro-abortion, I'm not afraid to say this publicly, that is so un-Jewish. You could be pro saving the life of a mother using extreme measures, but you can't say I'm celebrating an abortion, just like you can't say I'm celebrating an amputation. That is the Jewish mindset. But the mindset of society has changed, and it's continuing to change in many other areas of life as well. I don't want to go into more illustrations because it'll get us into a lot of not very comfortable areas. But Judaism's ethics and morality do not change. They are not situational. They're not based on what society, the winds of society. That's why the Mishnah begins the teachings of ethics with the words, Moses received the Torah at Sinai, that the ethics were given to Moses from God at Sinai, just like the laws were given, so were given the value system of Judaism, the ethics and the value system. Then it goes on to tell you that he passed it down to Joshua. What is this? How does this relate to ethics? How does this relate to us? This is historical, that Moses was the first recipient, Joshua was his disciple, and then the elders and the prophets. So the Rabbi, in a lengthy discourse, explains that it applies to every one of us, that when we receive the Torah, which includes ethics as well, there are 5 different stages. There's the stage of Moses, there's the stage of Joshua, there's the stage of the elders, there's the stage of the prophets, and the stage of the men of the great assembly. So the Rebbe explains it, and I'm putting it in my own words. The first prerequisite a person has to have to the teachings of the Torah is Moses, is humility. You have to come to Torah without saying, I'm the great intellectual, I'm the great scholar, I'm the noble person, and I am going to add the Torah to my repertoire of knowledge. You can do that with other subjects, and it won't be an impediment necessarily to that subject. You can think you're the most brilliant person and study mathematics, and study physics, study biology. I know of a lot of scientists who are very arrogant people, but it didn't diminish their scientific knowledge. You could be a brilliant scholar and be arrogant. But when it comes to Torah, yes, you could absorb the knowledge of the Torah being arrogant, but if you're not humble, you're not really receiving the Torah in its entirety. You're missing a major element. The divine element in the Torah is absent. God does not dwell in a place of arrogance, in a place of ego. So the first approach to Torah is you have to acquire the trait of Moses. That was Moses' greatness. If you ask, of all the traits that we know Moses possessed, which was the one that stood out the most? Well, you look in the Torah. The Torah tells us 2 things about Moses. One is that he was the greatest prophet, and the other one is that he was the most humble man on the face of the earth. There's a story of a rabbi who was not too smart, who lived about 250 years ago, and he said he became a disciple of the Baal Shem Tov eventually because he realized how foolish he was. He used to say, I always question the Torah. The Torah says that Moses was the most humble person on the face of the earth. What about me? He asked himself the question, how could Moses have been the most humble when I'm so brilliant, I know so much, and yet people don't even know how brilliant I am. I keep it a secret, so I'm so humble. So how could the Torah make a mistake and say Moses was the most humble person? And then he finally came to the conclusion, both are true. Moses was the most famous humble person. I'm not famous, but I'm still more humble than Moses. And then after a while, he realized how stupid he was, and he became a very great student of the Baal Shem Tov and changed his whole way of thinking. So the first step it takes for a person to absorb the Torah is Moses, is humility. The next step is Joshua. What was Joshua's greatest trait? He had many traits, certainly. But what the Torah says about him is he never departed from the tent. What? He never departed from the tent of Moses. He never left Moses. Wherever he was always in close proximity to Moses. That means the tenacity. If you really want to absorb Torah, tenacity is a necessary ingredient. You have to keep on attaching yourself to it. You can't just say, I listened to a lecture, I read a book, and now I have that in my repertoire. I have that in my bag. No, you have to keep on at it. Joshua may not have been the greatest disciple of Moses. Look, he was in competition with Aaron. He was in competition with Moses' nephew Hur. He was in competition with Pinchas. These were great people in their own right, and maybe they were more brilliant than Joshua, but Joshua became the successor not because he was the most brilliant or the most righteous, maybe he was, but not necessarily because of that, but because he was the most tenacious. He never departed from Moses. But that's not enough. You need elders. What does the word elders connote? The Talmud says that the word elders in Hebrew, zakein, means a person who acquired wisdom. Acquiring wisdom means that you have to use your mind. Judaism never allows you to leave your mind at the door, as some religions advocate. Yes, it starts off with humility, it starts off with tenacity, but you have to apply your mind, your intellect. You cannot acquire Torah without studying, literally studying and applying the intellect. But then it's still not enough. You need prophets. What is the characteristic of a prophet? Someone who is in constant awareness of a higher being. When you study Torah properly, you have to always realize that it's God's Torah. Yes, you have to use your own mind. God doesn't just plant it inside of you. Although before you're born, the Talmud says you're taught by an angel the entire Torah, and then when you're born, you're made to forget it. So the question is, what's the point? What's the point in teaching a fetus the whole Torah and then causing him to forget it? Why can't we just remember it? Because we're supposed to use our own mind. God does not put the Torah in our mind for us. I'm just dreaming that with AI, eventually he'll put a chip in our head and we'll know the whole Torah instantaneously. That's not the way Torah is supposed to be studied. You're supposed to apply your mind. Yes?
With the elders, I always thought of it as these are people who have experience in life. They're older. And so they have more understanding because they've experienced life.
Okay, but that's a very good interpretation, but the word elders usually does not mean older people. It means people who are more knowledgeable. The Talmud says, who is the true definition of an old person, zakein, the one who acquires wisdom. Now, it's true, the Talmud also says that when you are old, even if you're not an intellectual, you're educated by life's experiences, and you have to therefore respect a senior citizen even if they're not knowledgeable. But that's an extension of the original meaning of zakein, which means someone who is steeped in knowledge, who is constantly acquiring knowledge. But then we get to the prophets. A prophet is a person who has a communication with God, who's connected to a higher being. And that means when you study Torah, you have to always have that awareness that it's not just an academic exercise, but you're studying God's Torah. And that helps you in understanding the Torah properly. Then you get to the men of the Great Assembly. These men lived at a time when the teachings of the Torah were not just theoretical. Sometimes we could study the Torah and it's all theoretical. Much of the Torah is today theoretical because a lot of the laws of the Torah, the laws that pertain to the Holy Temple, we pray and hope that we should soon have to practice them, but right now they are theoretical. They're academic. But in the times of the men of the Great Assembly, when the Jews were reconstituting themselves in the land of Israel after the Babylonian exile, these were people who had to live the laws in actual practice. These are not just theoreticians. These were people, and it means that when you study Torah academically, theoretically, it's not as solid as when you know that there's a practical application. There's a famous story of one of the greatest Talmudic scholars of the 18th century. He's known as Rabbi Heschel. He was the rabbi of Prague. He was a very young man, I think in his early 20s, when he became the rabbi of one of the most important Jewish communities in Europe. And they tested him. They asked him 10 questions, 10 legal questions, and he had to give answers. Because the city was filled with great scholars. Some of the scholars were his equal. And he was a young whippersnapper. He was in his early 20s. So he answered all 10 questions and he got one wrong. So when they confronted him, he said, yeah, you got one wrong. You didn't score 100. He says, I bet that the question that you asked me was the only one that was not practical, was just a theoretical question. And they said, how did you know that? He says, because no rabbi, no matter how brilliant he is, could get everything right. So how could you rely on any rabbi? He can always make mistakes, but because he's doing something for other people in real life, he has divine assistance. And that protects the rabbi from erring. It's not a guarantee 100%, but it's more or less the only reason we could rely on someone is because what they're impacting other people's lives. People come to rabbis with life and death questions. And even if they're not life and death, they're crucial questions. But because they're doing something that has an impact on others, and it's their job to give the right answers, God gives them some support, as long as they're not arrogant about it and so on. He says, but if it's not practical, if it's just theoretical, you don't need God's support. So that's why I got it wrong, because, I'm not perfect. The others I got right because they were all practical and I had divine assistance. So the men of the Great Assembly were people who were not just theoreticians. These were people who were involved in actually applying these laws. And that's why whenever we learn something, when we apply it to our lives, we are much more capable of absorbing that wisdom. That wisdom becomes alive and becomes practical and something that is not just in the world of theory. We'll continue that next week, God willing, the three things that they taught.
But even for us to receive the spiritual elements or the mystical elements of Torah, literally Kabbalah means to receive, right? It's the receptivity that allows us to perceive and understand the spiritual elements.
Each generation was a recipient of the Torah. They received the Torah. They didn't just learn, but they absorbed it as well. And in order to absorb it, you have to go through all these different stages.